So after a year of owning the DJI Ronin 4D, is it still worth it? Oh heck yes. Let's dive in. I am so happy that I own this cinema camera. And after a year of owning it, yes, I'm glad I bought this very niche camera. But honestly, I thought this thing was dead. See, DJI never really did anything with it after launch. Sure, there was a couple of firmware updates, but for example, the 8K version is still not available. And this thing has been out for almost 2 years now. And that made me really nervous. But that was until recently, when DJI announced specific hardware and gear for this camera. DJI announced a cinema lens, and it's a zoom lens at T3. And from everything I've read about that lens, it's fantastic. And they also introduced the infamous flex cable or flex system, which basically splits this camera now into two. You now have a more manageable, lighter, and easy to maneuver system. Okay, let's start off with the obvious. After all, this is a camera. So how's the image quality? The image quality out of this camera is what you would expect from a true cinema camera. That true cinema performance that focuses on dynamic range and recovering that detail. Now, I personally wanted to wait for the 8K version. I figured, hey, if I'm gonna get this thing, let's future-proof a little bit more, but I'm happy with the 6K version. Besides, I couldn't wait any longer, and like I said, they haven't released the 8K version of the Ronin 4D. Okay, now let's talk about the next thing. I love the internal NDs. I love internal NDs, period. I never owned a cinema camera. I've rented some before, but when you've actually used a cinema camera for more than, let's say, 2 weeks or so, and then you go back to the screw-on ND filters, you just can't go back. I gotta tell you though, if Sony or Canon or whoever figures out how to put internal NDs into mirrorless cameras like the Sony a7S III or the FX3 or the Canon R5 or whatever, in that compact size with internal NDs alongside a cinema camera, there's beautiful things to be made. The next thing that I love about this camera is the 4th axis stabilization. And no, it's not a gimmick. It's commonly referred to, lovingly referred to as the chicken neck. But really, with all joking aside, it really truly is not a gimmick, and you're gonna get crazy stabilization. I mean, I'm able to get shots on this thing that look like they were on a dolly or a roller or a slider or on tracks. You really do get that big production value in this small package. And it's very effortless, if I'm being honest with you. You don't have to do a lot. That 4th axis stabilization along with the gimbal really does all the work for you. And you can get some amazing shots. So that brings me to one of the biggest pros. It's the ecosystem. You get an all-in-one ergonomic cinema package with an external monitor that's beautiful, that is bright and very intuitive with touch functions. Really nice handles that give you control of everything that you can think of, everything that you want to do, with easy to navigate buttons that are placed with the user in mind. The focus pull wheel or the zoom wheel is absolutely stunning. It's beautiful, it's intuitive, and it has very good tactile feedback. And even the little things like the handle on top, it's placed in a really good location. I can see here that there's a little zoom wheel and a manual button, and I feel like there's a lot more coming to the Ronin 4D with firmwares or other gear that's gonna make everything very practical, and it's exciting. Not to mention its remote capabilities. You can control this whole thing with a remote monitor. You can take the handles off, hook them up to your monitor, and control every aspect of this camera from a very far distance. I mean, the remote transmitter and the monitor itself just make this camera now a production camera. If you're a 3-man band or a 2-man band even, you can make some really beautiful things with this camera. And that's the biggest selling point, is you're getting a package, an ecosystem that's unmatched. How many out there bought an expensive external monitor for your Sony a7S III or your FX3? You can't touch the zoom, you can't swipe through the menu system, none of that. It's just a viewing monitor. Well, this thing has a beautiful external monitor that's equivalent to my Ninja 5, but with all of the functions that I just mentioned. Touch functions, buttons that are perfectly placed at easily navigate to whatever it is that you want to do. It's bright, it looks great, it's attached with the system, and everything works correctly. And that actually brings me to the next thing that I love about this camera. And it's sort of a love-hate relationship, but it's the LiDAR, it's the autofocus, it's the tracking. The tracking is fantastic. When you enable tracking, the gimbal will follow you, will follow the subject, whatever it is that you want to do. Even if you're trying to shoot some B-roll or you're shooting something cinematic, you're doing a hover, or maybe you're rotating down on the subject, but it's tracking the subject and it's following it, it gives it this like extra layer of dynamics, which really makes it interesting to the viewer. And if you're a one-man band, you can hit the tracking mode. If you're doing talking heads, which is overkill for this camera, it will track you. If you're doing interviews, you can have it track the subject. Maybe the subject's moving around. A cooking show, for example, it will track the chef as he's preparing the meals. It will do all that for you. Now, the next thing that I love about this camera may sound a bit cliche, or you might not think it's very important, but it's in regards to the menu system. For those of you that know, you'll know, right? The old Sony cameras had a horrible menu system. Canon has a pretty good menu system. Blackmagic has a great menu system. This camera has a wonderful menu system. It's easy to navigate. It's very similar to the Blackmagic, and considering it's the first try for DJI, they did a great job. Now, I think they can improve on the menu system, make it a little bit more innovative, and add on some extra features. But as a starting point, it's fantastic. It's already leaps and bounds ahead of a lot of other companies. So great job on the menu system DJI. And the last thing that I have, and trust me, there's many more, but this video would be extremely long, I love the battery life. The batteries work fantastic. They last for about 2 hours or so. I bought 4 batteries for this camera, and I have endless amount of battery life. I feel like I'm well taken care of. And you can also hook it up to power if you need to. So I feel like as far as powering this device, you're covered. Now, the batteries aren't super cheap, but they're not super expensive. I really like that this thing is just efficient, considering everything that it does. I mean, it's amazing that you get 2 hours plus on this thing. And another thing about this camera is it never overheated, nor do I expect it to, right? It has a fan and everything else. So if you're worried about overheating or anything like that, I've never experienced any issues regarding overheating. You can expect great battery life and great performance and great reliability. Now, with all that being said, there's a couple things that I wish they would improve on. The first thing is the rolling shutter. It's terrible. Let's be honest, it's terrible. And I don't know what happened there. It's probably due to the sensor. I mean, you can't expect it all to be perfect right out of the box, right out of the gate, but the rolling shutter is kind of bad. That's something that they can definitely improve on. It's just, it is what it is. And kind of related to the rolling shutter, the next thing I would improve on is the low light performance. Now, maybe I've been spoiled by my Sony a7S III, but it can do better. It's a cinema lens that's designed to be used in a studio environment with proper lighting and a lighting crew, and you're supposed to kind of have all those bases covered. Now, I know it has dual ISO or dual native ISO. If I recall correctly, it's 800 and 5000. Comparing that to the Sony a7S III, which has 640 and 12,800. I mean, you can literally make night into day with the Sony a7S III. If you are a run and gun person that's going to be doing documentaries and you may not have the production value that everyone else has, it's always clutch to have that low light performance. I mean, there's no other way of seeing it. It's better to have something and not need it than to need it and not have it. Okay, the LiDAR was listed as a pro on my list, but it's also a con. Let me explain. I love the LiDAR. I think it's innovative and it's exciting. I kind of wish this camera could do both eye tracking and LiDAR. Comparing the autofocus with this camera to the Sony a7S III or my Canon cameras, it's night and day. The LiDAR does a good job, don't get me wrong, and it gives you the ability to convert any manual lens into an autofocusing lens, but it has its limitations. If you're way too close or you're way too far, or it's dark, or if there's light being reflected back at the LiDAR, it confuses the unit. So having the option for both, the LiDAR unit and eye tracking, would make this thing fantastic. DJI, if you're listening, I think that's something that will improve on this camera, an already great camera, and it's something that everybody would want and go crazy for. Consider it. Again, the next thing that's on my list was a pro, but it's also a con, and it's going back to the internal NDs. Having internal NDs is fantastic, but I wish they were a little bit more discreet. So what do I mean by that? Sony does a fantastic job in their cinema lenses. They also have a auto ISO feature that will run through internal NDs for you to get that proper exposure. And the transition between the NDs are unnoticeable. You can't see it. With this camera, it has internal NDs. The internal NDs are located here, somewhere with the sensor, but they're noticeable. When the transition happens, it's sort of like a mechanical ND filter that goes in front of the sensor and you can see it switching. So it's not discreet. And finally, the last thing that I would improve on is the 1 terabyte hard drive. I bought the hard drive. I think it's great. It's a great idea to have a hard drive. You have all that extra storage. It's constantly fragmenting and it's telling me it needs to be reformatted. It's also very expensive. The hard drive itself is like $1,000 or whatever. And then the little adapter that, you put on there so you can actually use the thing is like another 300, or I don't know. The prices are just ridiculous. I think that DJI should just let someone else like SanDisk or whatever design something for them that's a lot more cost friendly. The hard drive is kind of necessary, I think, especially if you're going to be shooting 8K, but I think it can be implemented a little bit better and the price is just not reflecting the performance. So why won't I be personally buying the Flex system? I have several smaller cameras. I have the Sony a7S III, which I absolutely love. And I feel like if I wanted that compact package, I could just put the Sony a7S III on a gimbal. Now, granted, you're not going to get this camera, right? You're not going to get the same performance. You're not going to be able to control the camera remotely like you would with this Ronin 4D, but I just don't feel like I have a reason to buy it, at least now. Now, I do want to acknowledge that I think the Flex system is a wonderful, wonderful idea, and it really kind of solves a big problem with this camera, which was it's very niche and it was heavy. But again, the weight I don't think is a con because there's a lot heavier rigs when you fully rig them. But I think the Flex system will come in really handy and useful in tight areas. If you're trying to shoot the inside of a car, for example, if you're shooting a movie or a documentary or a commercial and you need to get that tight area and completely remotely control every aspect of the camera, then the Flex system makes a lot of sense. So this camera is niche, but it is not a gimmick, and I am so glad that I bought this camera. I'm excited to see what the future holds, and I'm really happy to see that DJI did not abandon this system because it was a hell of an introduction to the world of cinema cameras. And if I'm being quite honest, I think it's extremely modular, and there's a lot of potential. DJI could make small improvements and upgrades to this camera where you would theoretically basically get a new camera every time. Either that's through firmware or through additional add-ons and hardware. They could really take this camera and make it into a system that is now modular and expandable. And that makes me really excited. I can't wait to see what the future holds for this camera, whether it's firmware updates or add-ons or even the next generation to come. Thank you guys for watching.